the Bible is pretty earthy in its embrace of human failure and its constant invitation again to the people to commence that journey one more time. In other words, it's understood that the people will start in the right direction but always try to turn back. Sure.
But if you don't believe in God, then is there any point in moving into something which might, in fact, fail? Isn't it better to say, well, let's embrace the values of our society and just make sure we prosper, and to hell with everybody else? I'm saying this is, I believe, is the position of many people in our church, because I'm not sure that all that many people who are part of the church really believe in the God of love and the God that I see, in the Bible.
Well said. The only difference I would say is that it's not a matter of believing in God or not believing in God, it's a matter of which God you believe in. Yes?
There's a parallel there with my concern. I walk with you in terms of the methodology you're talking about. Where I have difficulties is in understanding how people of the church might view the story. What in fact is the story that you're talking about? In your analysis this morning, using the parable, which most people would call the story, you then take us into an analysis or an understanding of the much wider story of the people of faith through a long period of history. Right. This broad story is what I think is colouring, concerning, allowing the small parts to be developed in a way that's new.
Yes.
Many of our parishioners, I believe, would think that those stories themselves were the story, and would want only to stay within those.
Yes.
For me, those stories are useless unless they're in a community of faith and told in a community of faith, and I have a real horror of the thought of people simply sitting down and read the stories on their own, because they will be the story.
Oh boy, I was right with you up until about the last 10 seconds. There are lots of ways in which the church marginalizes its own story. One is by not reading it. The other is by turning it into a magical text. But another way is to chop it up. And unfortunately, I think what you were getting at is we just read little bits, completely taken out of context. And that could be a phrase or a favorite verse that are pulled out like little buttons and sewn onto this doctrinal cloth as proof texts. Or it could be favorite stories. But what we're trying to get the people to do is to read the whole story and to understand each episode within the framework of the whole story. So I agree with you, it is problematic when we are isolating these texts and extracting them from their context and so on. I do not believe there is a danger in putting the Bible in the hands of the people. I think that there will always be wrong-headed interpretation. History seems to verify that. But I would rather have, being, I suppose, a Protestant, and seeing that something good happened in the Reformation. See, the Reformation was all about trying to put the Bible back in the hands of the people. At least that's what it said it was about. It ended up backing away from that pretty fast. But the original insight of the Reformation was to say, hey, the Bible doesn't belong to the priests, it doesn't belong to the clerics, it doesn't belong to the kings, it belongs to the people. Let's put it back in the hands of the people. Is there a danger that there will be all kinds of crazy and even toxic kinds of interpretations? Of course. But I don't think that's a reason to keep the Bible from the people. I think the control of the community is to keep the people constantly reading the whole story and struggling together to interpret it. And I think the problem in our churches is the selective care and feeding of the congregation with just little bits and pieces of the text. That's another way in which the leadership stays in control. You know, there used to be, in the old-time conservatism, there used to be the type of Sunday school where people had the disciplines of reading through the whole Bible. I think that's not all that bad. I think there's something really nice about that. In other words, maybe we need to concentrate a little bit on biblical literacy in our churches.
I think you misinterpreted.
Okay, maybe I did.
To some extent,
Yeah.
in the end there. I'm not asking that the Bible be kept from the people, but that the reading of the Bible be kept within the community of faith.
Ah, yes, okay, I'm with you. Do you know Stanley Hauerwas's new book? Have you seen it? Stanley Hauerwas is a Methodist theologian in the U.S., and he's just written a book called Why Americans Shouldn't Read the Bible. And of course, the book, the thesis of the book is he's trying to get Americans to read the Bible. But he doesn't trust the way in which Americans read the Bible, which is as individuals only.
That's what I'm for.
Yeah. So you might be interested in that book. He's saying we need to put the Bible back into the community. And the community is the control. Not the clerical aristocracy and not the scholarly aristocracy, but the community. So we're on the same page. No pun intended. The church, I understand the church preeminently to be the people gathered around the story. Everything else, the liturgy, symbols, the other kinds of things that the church does, well, we can argue about that. But the one thing we share in common, it seems to me, is a church gathered around the story. And all throughout church history, not just the Reformation, the church has renewed its life by regathering around the story. Interestingly for me, as a Protestant, the people most interested in regathering around the story these days in the United States are Catholics. And that's largely true in the Third World as well, where the base community movement is largely a Catholic phenomenon. So it really is not about the battle lines of the 16th century. It's about wherever and whenever the church regathers around the story, cool things happen. One or two more comments, then maybe we can look at some more of the story. Yes?
Just wondered about whether the lectionary is a way it breaks up the readings and jump all over the place, whether that works against hearing the story.
Well, that's a real good question. The question is the lectionary. Does the lectionary work for us or against us in terms of biblical literacy, I think is the way I do state the question. And I've pondered that a lot because on the one hand, first of all, I didn't grow up in the church. So I didn't have all these rhythms and disciplines, and I had no biblical literacy, and then I converted through the Jesus movement at age 18, and then I reconverted when I met people like John Hurt to, the gospel of radical discipleship. And that was a kind of a free church, kind of radical Protestant, low Protestant kind of movement. But we very quickly moved in so that we didn't have a lot of the kind of lectionary apparatus. But then a lot of us were attracted to the disciplines of the lectionary as we tried to figure out how we act as worshiping communities. And so I know in our community that John and Carol were part of, we used the lectionary. We used the Episcopal lectionary. And we preached at it. And I think it's a wonderful discipline to have not only the text chosen for you, so you're not just choosing your favorite text, but there's also something wonderful about the whole church reading, a given text on a given Sunday, right? So all of that needs to be said. But then there's all the problems, the way the lectionary chops up the story, which are huge in my mind. As a narrative, as a person who wants to maintain the integrity of the narrative, there is no year in which I go crazier than year B in the lectionary, because I see what's being done to Mark, and I say, but wait,